Sounds good. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here with us today. It's great to see some familiar faces, some of whom I haven't seen for quite some time. And I also see some new folks, including some new folks that are joining our Taylor community. So welcome. Before we start, I just wanted to acknowledge that there is a lot going on in our country and in our world right now. Here in New Orleans, I know that many of us are feeling some stress and anxiety about an impending hurricane. If you're in higher ed, you might be swamped with the semester just starting. We all continue to be worried about the safety and health of our loved ones, including for those of you that have young kids. I know this is an incredibly stressful time. So in design thinking, we talk a lot about empathy. And I know many of our hearts are hurting for those near and far. And I don't know about y'all, but in this Zoom world where people can feel so apart and so disconnected, I find it helpful to ground myself in where I am in my body and in my breath. So I wanted to start today with just a brief breathing exercise. You're welcome to turn off your camera if you would like to do so. So allowing yourself to breathe in, allowing your breath to fill the whole cavity of your chest, and then exhale, allowing some tension to wash through you. Breathing in, filling yourself up with fresh, new breath of a new morning, a new day, and breathing out, sending a little love to someone who might need it today. Breathing in, filling yourself up with something or someone that you are grateful for. And breathing out, letting that gratitude flow through you from head to toe. One more time, breathing in and breathing out. If your camera's off, I invite you to turn your camera back on. And taking a moment to look at the beautiful people that are here with us today in this space. And just acknowledging our shared humanity and our gratitude for one another, and all the things that we're all dealing with in our personal and professional lives. And just feeling a moment of gratitude that we are able to be here in community for the next hour together. So hello, my name is Julia Lang. I'm a professor of practice at the Taylor Center. And at Taylor, we support many different kinds of learners who want to build skills in design thinking and social innovation. So this event, many of you have been here before, is part of our Design Thinking Breakfast series, which is hopefully a casual, playful way to learn about and try on new designerly ways of thinking, being, and doing, and thinking about how design thinking can be used to create social impact. So we also hope that today, not only are we learning from our amazing speaker, but that we have a chance to learn from each other, that each of you are bringing in a wealth of knowledge and experiences that we know are incredibly valuable to the community that we're creating. So for folks that are new to this space, this will not be a formal lecture. We invite you to engage informally in the chat throughout the session. And also many of us are in the Central or West Coast time zones, so feel free to eat breakfast, sip your coffee. We encourage you to take care of yourself in the next hour while we're here together. So with that, I would like to welcome Naisha Ford, our graduate assistant, who has fearlessly led this series all summer. And she is really the one that has planned everything. But before I hand it over to her, she just graduated. And so I'd love to give her a little round of applause, either with your Zoom hands, you can turn off and actually give her. She has been such an incredible asset to our Taylor community, and she's going to be deeply, deeply missed. So thank you, Naisha, for everything you've done, and take it away.
Thank you so much, Julia. Not only for the breathing exercise, but for that warm introduction. It's really been a joy to lead DT Breakfast and work with the Taylor Center for the past year and over the summer. So again, for those that have attended DT Breakfast before, my name is Naisha Ford. I'm a graduate assistant of the Taylor Center. This will actually be my last DT breakfast that I will be hosting. I'm very sad, but I'm so happy to turn this over to the Taylor Center and another graduate assistant to take my place. But without further ado, I'm happy to introduce our last speaker of the summer. Today we have Woodrow Winchester III. He is the Director of Professional Engineering Programs for the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, UMBC. He is also the Director, Professional Development and Continuing Education for the American Society of Engineering Management, where he coordinated and facilitated, in partnership with UMBC, a webinar series that explored diversity, equity, and inclusion in technical management and technological development. Selected as a member of the second cohort of the I Aspire Leadership Academy, Woodrow is an advocate for more equitable, inclusive, and consequential approaches to technology design and deployment. As a thought leader, Woodrow has published works in influential practitioner-oriented publications such as InCost Insight Magazine, AMC Interactions, Fast Company Magazine, and The Conversation. He has been a featured speaker in such venues as Premier 2020, Health Experience Design Conference, and the University of Maryland A. James Clark School of Engineering. And without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to Woodrow. Thank you so much for coming all.
And thank you so much, Naisha. And just sound check, everyone can hear me? Awesome, thank you so much. Again, thank you so much, Naisha, for that introduction. And Julia, thank you so much for that opening and really kind of contextualizing the day. And it's really fitting, not only for just putting things in perspective as we are as humans in this world, but also in contextualizing this talk. The focus of today's talk is kind of evolved a bit, but the premise has kind of stayed the same. So it's really interesting, as Naisha kind of introduced today in the series and the focus of the Design Thinking Breakfast series around empathy, and again, kind of reiterated by the opening that Julia kind of facilitated, really talking about, at the core, more empathic approaches to design. And today, what I would like to do is just kind of have a focused discussion. And again, as Naisha kind of detailed, want to keep it interactive, very informal. I do have it, unfortunately, structured more so as a lecture, as a professor. I think that's how I've just been trained to kind of think and kind of structure presentations and talks. But I love the nature of this series. I've been an active participant, and I think we'll be able to kind of navigate this in a more informal sort of manner. To kind of give some additional sort of context in terms of how this presentation is structured, I've got a series of kind of quotes, kind of provocative sorts of quotes, to really kind of catalyze thought and discussion. So we'll use those as kind of prompts to kind of move through the content of this talk. So just a quote here to kind of level set and just kind of reiterate the criticality of culture and culture in design. And what I will do, and I failed to do that, Naisha, I did modify the abstract for this talk with all the resources that I talked through, and I have those linked. So I'll send that to you immediately after this talk, and all the participants can have that, have those resources. So to give a title to the talk, I'm using this title, Widening Design Narratives, Culture and or as Context in Design. I love this sort of image here. I've been kind of utilizing this. This has been kind of inspiration and motivation for me for the last couple years in terms of my exploration, as Naisha kind of introduced about me, in inclusive and consequential or anticipatory sort of design. Had the opportunity to spend some time with Alicia Wormsley. She did not create these words, and she is adamant about the fact in terms of, the statement, but this statement specifically here, there's been installations of this throughout the country. But while I was in Pittsburgh, this was done in a recently gentrified neighborhood, and it just sparks such, conversation in the community around, gentrification, equity, inclusion, through differing sorts of contexts. So it's just a really nice reminder in terms of art, and art as inspiration and motivation for us in design. So again, this talk has kind of evolved a bit when I was first invited, and thank you so much for the invitation to be with you today. I had the opportunity, I guess it's been, and this summer's just flown by, maybe 2 months ago, where the Black Designers 2021. This was the second sort of conference or convening of Black design thought leaders. And it really just so motivated me and inspired me, and really kind of helped to trigger some new kind of thought trajectories as I think about inclusive design and what that means. And I wanted to integrate some of those newer thoughts, into this presentation as we explore kind of culture and design. So additional level setting at best. I mean, the bar is so high with this design thinking breakfast. Again, I have just been so inspired by the speakers. So for me, setting the bar here, at best, more questions than answers. So again, hopefully catalyzing some thought. And at the core, also, what I would like to achieve here is to motivate a more reflective sort of practice. Kind of moving towards that vision of the reflective practitioner that I'm sure many of you have heard about. And really at the heart of that is looking at design as a conversation, with the situation, which then includes considerations of culture. And then also what I would like to do, kind of extending those thoughts, connecting some dots with the intent of amplifying some thoughts. And for me specifically is this exploration of Afrofuturism as a design lens, and additional voices around culture and underpinning more inclusive approaches to design. So just to kind of, again, additional sort of level setting here as we get started. When we talk about culture, what does culture mean? How do we define culture? There are lots of definitions that exist there. A lot of thought leaders in design have kind of operationalized culture in a design sort of context. So I'm going to use these words to kind of best describe how I kind of operationalize culture in this particular context. So we're looking at culture from a social cultural sort of lens. So common traditions, mindsets, social patterns, habits, beliefs of a given sort of group. So again, some prompts to kind of get us thinking. So, and again, you'll have the resources here. Technology is not a good traveler unless it's culturally calibrated. So that's kind of this overarching premise. And how do we culturally calibrate our design practices and outcomes? So again, this is really reflective in nature. Where the Black designers really been the kind of the catalyst for this sort of reflection that truly reflects, my journey from, engineer as designer. I'm a little, I would say in terms of background, a little different than most of the speakers. I do come from a traditional engineering background. My undergrad and graduate degrees are in industrial and systems engineering. And kind of moved into more of a design sort of practice. My dissertation work was in human factors ergonomics, which really kind of put me more on that design sort of trajectory, and more specifically kind of design research. So moving from that arena to, engineering design educator. So practitioner to educator, and now as a program director. So a person that, develops, programs, which I think, we're going to kind of get to this a little bit in terms of kind of the influence that has in terms of kind of moving the discourse forward as well. So some things kind of came out of this sort of reflection and reflective sort of activity that I've kind of been going through that really that I would like to kind of put out there and have you to reflect on as well, especially, as an engineer. This notion of techno-solutionism, really, when we talk about problems, with engineers, we want to quickly solve them. Got a problem, I want to solve it, and specifically want to solve it with some sort of technological solution. So, coming to the table with that sort of mindset, and what does that mean in terms of, how I approach design? So some questions kind of came out of that, and a little bit of this we're going to explore this morning. So, what is technology? How do we define that? And then when we talk about technology as a solution, from what perspective? And, I've really been kind of thinking about that as well, this notion of technology as an enabler. And what does that mean? And, oftentimes we think about, that it's to fix something, so is there a place and space for us to kind of counter that deficit sort of narrative when we think about, technology and technology as an enabler in different sorts of contexts? This notion of reductionism, again, coming from an engineering sort of background, kind of reducing, simplifying in order to better understand and tackle, may not be the best approach, especially as we look at, technology being engaged in differing sorts of, aspects of humanity, and as we see the consequences and implications of that. So kind of this notion of the criticality of context and culture as context. And what I've really appreciated about this series and really has begun to kind of catalyze in my thinking and in my reflection, positionality, and really beginning to kind of think about that in terms of, bringing your whole self to the design, conversation. And what does that mean? So I did, as earlier with the talk, I thought I was going to go in a different sort of direction. There was a paper that I posted, that Naisha actually posted for me, that kind of some pre-reading that explored kind of what human-computer interaction could do in terms of HIV prevention. Some work that I did early on in my design research sort of career. But what that kind of brings to life is this notion of kind of lived experience, and what lived experience can actually and potentially kind of offer in terms of enriching the design narrative, and what that could actually, what that could actually offer. So that being said, the value of this, it truly is there. So without deep self and systems awareness, we often reproduce the systems of oppression regardless of our intent. And that's why I really wanted to kind of talk about this journey that I've been on in terms of, of my career. Not in my intent is not to replicate the status quo and to further oppress, right? But when I think about kind of these guiding sort of principles and kind of how I've operationalized those in my thinking and in my actioning and in my doing, am I actually, reproducing, those same systems of oppression, or am I truly kind of, dismantling and rebuilding? So, really have to take some time to really kind of, step back for a moment and really kind of think about, what are these things that are kind of, guiding and governing your thinking and doing, and what the implications of those are, to your work. So kind of roadmap for today. kind of talked about my journey in terms of this kind of reflection. I'm using these hashtags because these were the hashtags that were kind of utilized in Where Are the Black Designers? So there's some really cool sort of quotes floating around on Twitter that you can pick up on, by querying on those hashtags. So widening design narratives, that's where we're beginning to kind of talk about culture to do that. Expanding the centering. As we talk about culture and culture in design, what I would offer in terms of oftentimes the challenge associated with that is then how do we have a lot of work that's been done in terms of developing specific sort of design methods, tools, and techniques that we can utilize to understand culture and those relevant sort of cultural considerations. But the challenge often is translating those into design. So I have some cool examples to kind of talk through that. Some work that I'm beginning in terms of Afrofuturism. So as we expand the centering, what does that mean as we go beyond white imagining? And then kind of closing here in terms of, how now can we, in essence, shift the power? So talk a little bit about some work that I'm doing with this design thinking approach called vision-enabled design thinking, which really begins to kind of frame an approach with the premise of shifting power. So excited to kind of talk about that. Some thoughts in terms of moving forward, and then not that we're going to wait until the end for questions and closing thoughts, but have some dedicated space for that. I was just checking the chat to see if there was anything there that I needed to address. So starting this conversation around culture, I love this quote, nothing exists in isolation. And it was really interesting. And it was just truly brought to life with the opening, that we had today by Professor Lang, putting into context, what's happening in the world and how that influences, our being and thus our doing. So we really have to be mindful of that. And I really appreciate that exercise this morning, which really kind of brings that to life. So again, this quote, design divorced from context in which the product is used is of little value to its audience. Cognitively, this makes sense. Most designers agree that they have to consider the environment, culture, and situation as a part of the process of developing a new product or redesigning an old one. But practically, context and culture get little play in design meetings. And also not only in design meetings from a practice sort of perspective, but also what we do from an education sort of perspective as well, in terms of talking about culture and design in most of our design and engineering sort of programs. So, the question is, why is that the case? So when we think about, what we're doing and how we're kind of, I guess doing is kind of the word to use in this case. Culture, in design, is there opportunity for more? And one thing that kind of stood out to me, and this happened during Black History Month. So I don't know if we've got some Apple aficionados in the audience. I'm sure we got a lot of designers, so a lot of designers love Apple products. So it's really interesting to kind of watch Apple with their Apple Watch for Black History Month, which it was really interesting to kind of see that in terms of what they did. So it's really kind of excited to heard some press around it, that they're this redesign or this edition of the Apple Watch, which really kind of takes into, that was designed by Black designers and mention of culture in the context of its design. So I was just really kind of intrigued to see what this could possibly be. Spoiler alert, I was disappointed. But what they did with this watch in terms of, for Black History Month, and they're calling it the Black Unity Watch, redesign the band, so kind of utilize the red, black, and green, colors, which has some significance in terms of Black peoples in the United States, the colors of the Pan-African flag specifically. And then, the watch face displays an ever-changing pattern. So you can actually get this watch face even if you have one of the earlier sort of editions of the Apple Watch that dynamically shifts as, it moves, creating a unique face for everyone. So just to play on, just the interface itself in terms of the coloration, and then some graphical design elements associated with it. So, that was the Apple Watch, Black Unity. So again, this notion of, can we go further, when we talk about, culture and integrating culture, in design. So another quote to kind of, add some thought here. Just as we can't end racism by stopping one act of violence against a Black, Indigenous, or person of color, we cannot prevent exclusion or bias by focusing only on the colors of user interface elements. Everyone involved in product development needs to take responsibility for creating inclusive technology. And oftentimes that's what we see. And as I step through some examples that I have a little later in the presentation, when designers think about culture, it's these surface sort of elements, aesthetics, but again, can we go further, widening the design, narrative? So, again, beginning to kind of answer that question, early on posed by Olga, in terms of little play in meetings, why, there's understanding that's evolving that suggests, that why. Today's designers work at a distance from their widely diverse communities of users. We can do designers a great service by finding ways to take them beyond their own experience, and culture. So this is Jane Fulton Suri, famous cultural design anthropologist, doing some, I think she's pretty much retired now, but did some really cool foundational work in terms of kind of exploring culture and design. Designers hold immense power over the process and outcomes of the work. And yet our lives are rarely directly impacted, by the challenge. So again, this issue of little play of culture, because we're oftentimes distant, from these diverse communities, of diverse communities. And oftentimes, in terms of the work that we do, we're not the ones directly impacted. So it becomes one of those, not that we don't care, but really that understanding of. So back to kind of earlier thoughts expressed as we kind of opened up today, the empathy. So where's the empathy? So how we design technologies reflects what we value, who we think is important, and in what ways, which places people in possibility. So as we talk about the narrative, so design is political. There's been discussion of that in the context of this series. Those in power, kind of drive this sort of decision making. Current ways of designing technologies frequently narrow those possibilities. Tech design is dominated, as we know, by narrow demographic, predominantly white and Asian, white collar, highly educated, and urban. So kind of shifting in terms of then what does that mean? What are the implications to design? As a result, designers propose products that suit their own needs. And it's interesting. So again, we've got this great resource, and I think this was brought up in the previous Design Thinking Breakfast, this piece by Trisha Wang in Fast Company, the most popular design thinking strategy is BS. You gotta read that incredible sort of piece. And she kind of uses as an example, Jewel. So it's really interesting in terms of, how design thinking, when we think about, ultimately what the outcomes of that, should be, how did we end up with this product with this addictive sort of property, and with these consequences that we're seeing in terms of use and the addiction of young people to these products. So really kind of thinking about that and how we got to where we are at this point. So how do we then begin to kind of think about widening the design narrative? So in order to do that, really thinking about how we can ultimately expand the centering. So again, kind of utilizing that quote from Phoebe Singers at Cornell, in terms of who's dominating and how design is now centered. How can we now expand that centering? So, I would offer, culture is a way by which we can do that, but we can do better. in terms of that. So to use as a case study, I'm going to kind of use some early work and work that I'm hoping to pick back up on because, again, my career trajectory has kind of changed more in an administrative sort of capacity versus research, but did some early work in the connected fitness space and really kind of thinking about, connected fitness technology design and who are they responsive to and who was actually centered in the design of these sorts of technologies, meaning like the Fitbit, Apple Watch. So it's really interesting. So I have this as to provide some thought in terms of kind of when we think about expanding the centering and what that means and culture and kind of how the culture of as and is context kind of can flavor and change the design narrative. So Black women possess, because specifically my work was kind of looking at, opportunities in terms of increasing engagement of Black women, in the use of these technologies to address, health disparities. Activity is critical in addressing some of these disparities. So what can technology offer as an enabler, for physical activity, thus impacting some of these health disparities among Black women? So a lot of work has been done in terms of exploring, that there are a variety of sociocultural norms that can influence, aka motivate, Black women's engagement, in physical activity. And this really is brought to life. I've been following this movement, Girl Track, and very successful movement around, motivating Black women around movement and physical activity. And it's really interesting. So to kind of to look at this in contrast. So, when they talk about, when Girl Track kind of talks about movement, it's you can see in the sign that I've kind of got highlighted here, we walk for healthier bodies, families, communities. So, this different sort of motivators around, physical activity. It isn't about, and then it isn't about, so kind of moving to what we see in a typical sort of implementation. And this is what Apple is utilizing for, the Apple Watch. They call it the burn bar. I don't know how many of you all actually kind of utilize it. I do, but not the best, but it's what suffices until we could get something better out there. But again, it's centered around heart rate, calories burned. So those are the sort of motivators that are kind of utilized by this particular kind of interface in regards to physical activity. So you kind of see that kind of stark sort of contrast in terms of when we think about design of these sorts of technologies, who's being centered and what and how that what could be the resultant of that as a technology in an enabling physical sort of activity and what those possibilities could be. So we kind of see those sorts of differences. So again, can we go further? And really, back to that one of the quotes that I had cited earlier in terms of us as designers, designing for us, not for, our communities and diverse users. It was really interesting. So kind of carrying this example of Apple, there was a recent article, I believe it was in Men's Health, and the VP of, I think it's Connected Fitness, I think is his actual title, for Apple, is really kind of talking about, the inspiration and kind of the process in terms of developing, this interface. And, it was really interesting. So I cut and paste here because I was like, I can't believe this. We know as designers, what's that the original sort of not canon but mantra in terms of you are not your user. He goes on to state here, we had to think hard about how to curate the experience so you're not overwhelmed by metrics and animations and those things happening, and it works too. And then he goes on to say, in my Fitness Plus workouts, I found that seeing my heart rate bolded or spurred me to push harder. So, but, I'm sorry, it's not about you. But, really kind of, again, that mindset oftentimes that we have, and, it may be not consciously aware on some level that these assumptions and biases around how our thoughts and our assumptions and what works for us, in terms of working for everyone else. Again, how do we then begin to kind of, expand that centering? And then as we see, other sort of players, kind of, reconceptualize or conceptualize design in this particular sort of context as well. I was really kind of disappointed to see Peloton kind of go in a similar sort of direction. So really, again, playing on this notion of, gamification. So, it's like, gamification doesn't respond for everyone. Are there other ways by which, again, expanding the centering, widening the design narrative, that we can really begin to kind of think about design in this particular sort of context? So I've really been kind of, again, back to some reflection here, and really kind of building off a lot that's been discussed in the talks in this particular series, especially around decolonizing design. And I do see Professor Noel here, and I'm so great to see her face. I tell you, she has been such an inspiration to me, and has afforded many opportunities. I just had to say that. So, again, so as we expand, the centering, and culture can be a means by which to kind of facilitate that. So I've really been excited about some work, and I don't want to butcher his name, but I do have the links associated with some talks and some papers that he's written, as he talks about this notion of going beyond inclusion. And what does that mean? And kind of situating that within this context of, decolonizing design. And he goes into this notion of, we talk about a center, and this is what I think Professor Noel has kind of, influenced me in terms of thinking too, that there can be these multiple sort of centers, this pluriverse that kind of exist in design. And, he's really kind of picking up on that as well, and thinking about, well, then how can we kind of implement that, in practice? So kind of really excited to kind of see this sort of work happening, and going beyond, centering to thinking about, multiple centers, and how can this eventually kind of play out again, in practice. So again, to kind of step through some examples. So, what are these cultural factors? Kind of utilizing connected fitness space as a little bit of context, and then how do we translate and design these sorts of questions? So again, we have tools and techniques that we learn that have been developed in terms of capturing these insights, but what do we do with them once they're captured? How can we then incorporate these insights that reflect this multiple sort of centering, in design? So I have this quote here that really kind of, brings to life, this centering, kind of utilizing the girl track as kind of the centering. So then, what could that possibly mean in terms of, actual product design? So, as opposed to, calories burned and heart rate and that sort of thing, they emphasize the rewards of taking time for yourself, getting outside and connecting with others. They don't talk about hypertension or body mass index, but about feeling less anxious and having more energy. They don't talk about looking good. And, oftentimes that's what we see the focus, in terms of calories burned, but about looking alive, having that girl track glow. So what could that possibly mean as we think about, translating those insights into design? So to kind of illustrate the conundrum, in essence, we have to be clear in terms of what our intentions are. And there's a great resource if you're interested in exploring culture in design as a basis, this text, and I have that as a resource, Culture Sensitive Design. I've read this like several times and actually was reading it. I just got off a little bit of a vacation. But again, great book in terms of just talking about culture in design at a very theoretical sort of level. So I challenge you, if you're interested, to read that. So, and the intention in terms of kind of leveraging, culture in design can vary. And our focus in terms of this talk and the works that I'm going to explore is what's called culturally attuned design. So design that is in tune with a certain cultural group. So, and then what are those relevant sorts of insights, and how do you gather those sorts of, insights? So we've got, again, different design research methods and tools that we can utilize to do that. But then I offer, it's been my experience and affirmed by the literature, translation becomes kind of this challenge. So, there's some art, with the translation as we talk about, creativity. And there is some science associated with translating those insights into design. And then, there's there's some magic thrown into the mix as well, so, it's kind of question mark there, and what is that sort of magic, that exists, or the magic in terms of that process to get to design that's in tune, with a given sort of cultural group. So again, we're kind of focusing on that translation sort of piece. So to step through some examples in design, I'm going to look kind of across different sorts of domains of design. So this was a really cool piece. I challenge you to look at this brilliant Somali architect. I think he's actually Somali American. Born in Italy to Somalian parents. So he's hoping to rebuild Somalia by looking to the past for a vision of the future, specifically from an architectural sort of perspective. So, this premise of, I wanted architecture to bring back the sense of belonging that was destroyed in the war. So when we talk about culture, and architecture, in that particular culture and how that was destroyed from war, what does that mean today to modern architecture? So, really beginning to kind of understand, what does that mean? What are those sort of cultural sort of factors? And then how do we translate that into design? So in that, thank you so much, Naisha, for providing that link. So as we think about, as he thinks about culture in that context, so he utilizing the principles of Islam to actually, so in this Twitter piece, so working on prototype middle-class, low-cost housing that respect the principles of Islam, that is culturally corrected with common spaces that respect the privacy, that are open to how I think there was a typo in the tweet, but how guests and family, I think, navigate, this sort of space. So, so those principles of Islam, so then how do we then translate those, into design, and specifically architectural design in this context? And that's what he's grappling with, and some of these prototypes begin to kind of, explore. And Stephanie brings a really important sort of notion to bear as we kind of think about this. It is so much of culture, and thank you for articulating that, is below the surface. And that's what I mean, that we can go further, in terms of, putting red, green, and black on it, in terms of, these are the colors of the African flag. And now we've got a culturally attuned product, where we add some motifs that reflect, maybe even out of context, on a particular product. We've got this culturally attuned product. No, it's not. It's problematic. And when we talk about engaging with culture and design and what that means, and how culture is appropriately translated in design, it does go deeper, and we have to go deep in terms of that understanding, to obtain that sort of understanding, and then to translate into design. Another interesting sort of example. I love this designer, and I'm sure many of you as well. He is truly a hero of mine, and just been following his career since the early days, and he's young himself so far. And most of, I'm sure you're aware of him from a fashion sort of perspective. The Bushwick Birkin is kind of what he's known for right now, but it's really interesting as he kind of talks about that, because that's kind of in the on everybody's kind of radar. He goes back, I'm a fashion designer. I do I've got clothes, so it's not just the Bushwick Birkin that I've done. So it's really interesting. He was actually invited by the Liberian Olympic, he's Liberian American, to design the uniforms for, I think, I can't remember specifically, and it may be here, maybe not, but a number of the Liberian Olympic teams, I don't think had a lot of team participants. Liberia didn't, but I think track and field and a couple other events. But it was very interesting, and I challenge you to read this piece because it really kind of gives you a peek behind the curtain in terms of his process. And I screenshot this here because it really brings to life, as he was invited in to do this, the question that he had was, to be true and authentic. And back to Stephanie's point, that it's more than just, the colors or motifs that we see. What is Liberian fashion? And he goes on to say, again, to Stephanie's point, it's not just putting kente print on a tank top, and then saying that's Liberian, right? And then, even as Stephanie has kind of alluded to as well, going deeper, what does nationality, even mean? So if we're going to truly, design attuned to culture, what is that, and how do we then translate that? How is that translated into design? So, that becomes even, more seasoned designers, as you can see across these different sorts of contexts, kind of face that, that similar sort of conundrum. Some interesting work has happened in game design that I've really been kind of inspired by. So I know it's a lot of words here, but I will again forward to Naisha this article that kind of talks about this. This was in the I can't remember, Conversationalist. So talking about video gaming encourage indigenous cultural expression. So some really interesting points this designer kind of made in terms of how they utilized some cultural aspects in not only in the design of the game, but then how by integrating those, they catalyze discussion around culture and design and what does that mean, and then also I think there's also a third trajectory here in terms of how culture and again these multiple centers afford and increase the opportunity for innovation within the game space as well too. So it was really interesting here. So to kind of bring that to life, so here they talk about in terms of winning or losing the game, quote unquote. The premise is you have to gather salmon, wild blackberries, and clams for a community feast. So from a traditional sort of perspective, when we think about games, what would be the objective? Who collects the most salmon and clams and blueberries, right? But that's not the case in this particular context. Kind of utilizing this specific culture, in the context of designing this game. So, but if players gather more salmon than is requested, or try to grab a berry so quickly that they gather unripe ones or stay too long, they lose. But typically, from a Western American sort of perspective, when we look at traditional sort of games, it's all about, quickness and quantity. Those are the metrics by which, kind of utilize for winning. But that's not the case here. So in this particular sort of cultural sort of context, thinking about it more holistically. So what is not the win individually, but thinking about win in the context of win for the collective, for the all. So, a whole different sort of framing, around, design. So it's interesting. So that gives us some insight in terms of, how we can then leverage these sorts of insights from a cultural sort of perspective, in design. So game design is doing some really interesting sort of work in that regard. some additional sort of insights there. I know I'm getting close to time, so I'm going to quickly kind of not go through that. But again, I challenge you to read this article. Yep. So thank you, Naisha. Time check. So I'm just going to quickly move here. So, what are the cultural factors? How do we translate into design? And then a third question. So what are the implications? And I love this headline. So what are the implications? Misunderstanding and ignorance are the implications, and it's unfortunate that's the case. A lot of Olympic examples here because, I was actually kind of pulling part of this presentation and kind of going through this reflective through in the context of the Olympics. And I'm sure many of you heard about, the controversy associated with the swim caps and the sole cap that was designed specifically for swimmers with more voluptuous curly hair to accommodate more voluptuous, hair. So, and the controversy associated with, utilizing those caps, in this context. So, I say that, for that third question. So as we do, we're unfortunately fighting a battle, as we think about this widening the design narrative, but we've got to push. And then kind of want to go here real quickly. So again, what are the implications? So what I found so intriguing, so as kind of doing some research, for this talk, I came across this article in New York Times. So, where, girl trek, in terms of this notion around, it's not me, it's we, white young males have appropriated, fitness technologies around, support and support as a collective. So what that brings to life is, so values can be universal. So oftentimes I get the question is, so what are you trying to say? We're going to have a black connected fitness device and we go have a, no, that's not what the premise is here. As we kind of widen the narrative, increase the centering, multiple centers, we can converge on, these a more universal, oftentimes sort of solution. So as we can see, what works in a girl trek perspective, even works with young white men and how they're utilizing fitness technologies, which is counter to kind of this dominant sort of narrative, the design trajectory that we're going with these sorts of technologies. So I thought that was, really kind of intriguing. And this piece here is that we should inclusivity that shows rooting narratives in one experience need not mean the exclusion of others. So again, it's not a zero-sum game. And oftentimes, when we talk about inclusion, it means excluding someone. No. So really, I was kind of excited to show that. So the work that I'm doing, so yeah, quickly, and it's kind of, then this translation, what can support with that. I'm really excited about this notion of vision concepting as a process to assist with translation. So that means kind of playing with design. So utilizing design as a part of the research to kind of play around with different sorts of concepts and thinking about culture in different sorts of ways and instantiating in different sorts of ways to begin to explore how we can eventually kind of translate that. Some cool work was done in terms of, this whole notion of reimagining or defund the police. What does that mean? So some cool work was happening in terms of, visualizations around, what that potentially could be. So that's what vision concepting is. So some really great examples that exist in that space. This is where I'm going in terms of utilizing, Afrofuturism in design. So widening the design narrative, culture, playing with culture through vision concepting. So some of that magic is kind of going beyond the white imagining is what I call kind of that magic sort of space there. So engaging the imagination, vision concepting kind of supports with that. So as we talk about girl trek and that notion of, not I, but we, you know, what does that kind of mean, and could that look? Not that these would be implemented, but inspire thoughts around actual implementation, you know, in design. Been working on a method which kind of incorporates that's vision enabled design thinking. And Naisha will have the link to that particular paper, which kind of talks about that. And then here's where I begin to kind of talk about this whole notion of shifting the power and how this can actually be utilized by, you know, the impacted group. I don't want to say user, but, you know, users, just as term, you know, shifting the power and allowing communities to design for themselves. And this is where I pick up from the brilliant talk that Professor Harrington did two talks ago, as she kind of utilized Afrofuturism, you know, as this kind of vision concepting to kind of help inform not only design research, but outcomes as well. So moving forward, I think we're at a stage where we can begin to do some really cool work in terms of, you know, back to what this series has really kind of talked about, decolonizing design, the wind is behind our back, really this thought about culture and design to go beyond inclusion and what does that mean, and thinking about the beauty that these groups and bring to the table, and how that can be centered in design. And this need for more work around process. And I challenge folk on today's call to just, you know, let's think about process, because process dictates product. So we really need more work in that regard in terms of widening design narratives, expanding the centering, the magic of going beyond white imagining, and then ultimately kind of shifting that power. Okay, so some thoughts to kind of end with, and thank you. It's a lot. I apologize. More than one. It didn't seem to be that much when I went through it by myself, but yeah, that's normally what happens.
Well, thank you so much, Woodrow. I really do want to be cognizant of time. So if you do have any questions, like I will be dropping Woodrow's LinkedIn into the chat. So feel free to connect with him on LinkedIn. Again, just want to say thank you so much for this very insightful talk, Woodrow. And I'm actually going to transition it to Julia for some last remarks.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Woodrow. I invite people to leave any final comments or questions in the chat. Really appreciate you being here with us. And if folks need to cycle off, go ahead. But I just wanted to take 1 minute. We're excited to welcome a new member that's going to be heading up our design thinking for social impact work. So Chris Dimrick is on the call here. He's going to be as visiting assistant professor with the Taylor Center. And I wanted to just allow him to introduce himself and talk a little bit about what is coming down the pipeline for design, learning more about design thinking and becoming involved.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks, Woodrow, for a really wonderful talk. And I think most importantly, to thank Naisha for setting such a solid foundation for this program. I'm really excited to continue it for the next year as I'm in this position. And as I know some of y'all are the people who've applied for the position that Naisha currently holds, the Design Thinking and Programs Graduate Assistant. And so I'm really looking forward to speaking with y'all next week. And yeah, I'm sure I've looked through y'all's materials so far, and it's going to be challenging to have to choose between y'all. A lot of wonderful applicants. And I'm sure that even if you aren't the person who's selected, we'll be able to continue attending these programs and be a part of other things that we do here at the Taylor Center. Yeah, so I guess I'll just kind of leave it at that with consciousness of time as well. But we will be hosting another design thinking breakfast probably late in September, maybe early October, depending on how fast we'll get new people onboarded. But we really look forward to seeing y'all again soon. And I think that's all we got, right?
Yes, and with that, I will close the DT breakfast. Thank you all for coming. And again, if you have any questions for Woodrow, please feel free to email them to me or connect with him on LinkedIn. But thank you. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Woodrow.
Thank you all. Great seeing you.
Bye.
Stay safe.
Thank you all. It's great.